Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. It's time for the third installment of my elemental themed Space Marines, and this time I'm making one that represents water. As with the previous parts, I'm starting with just a body of a Space Marine, and this one's from the Intercessor Squad pack. When I sit down and I plan these Space Marines, I like to think about all the different parts that I'm going to use. I don't own a lot of Space Marine kits, but part of the reason I did this series was to show that you can try and make something cool and different even if you don't have a lot of parts and you don't want to spend money on lots of different parts. When it comes to choosing the equipment for each Space Marine, I want to think about the job that they're doing. So as I've done in the previous episodes, I have thought about what this guy will do. And I wondered if I could make it so that he was someone who infiltrates and gets aboard ships. So I thought, why not use a grappling hook and a knife? And then when he's swimming around underwater, he can use the grappling hook to attach to the underside of ships, and he can also use it to scale the side of ships, and then he can use his knife and any other little guns he has around his belt to get on board and attack all the people on that ship. And using that lore is kind of the best way that I can get around the balance of not having lots of parts, but still being able to give him weapons that actually fit the theme. The helmet I chose has a torch on the top because he would need some light underwater where it's dark, and it also has these two kind of canisters on the side of his cheeks that I thought would kind of look like breathing apparatus for diving. Speaking of diving, he's going to need some oxygen tanks for him to be able to breathe underwater for a longer time than a normal Space Marine could, so I grabbed some of these oxygen tanks from a breacher kill team, and I decided I'd try and include these if I can. As I was going with the grappling hook, I thought it made sense to be able to give him an extra grappling hook in case he loses his main one. So I grabbed this little side accessory that has a little gun and a grappling hook, and I thought that would go perfectly around his belt or on the side of his leg. Then I looked at a few small accessories that I could add around, and I thought this little container would be good because he can't really take leather bags down underwater. And I also thought about this mine that I was going to use on the Earth Elemental guy, but didn't use that one in the end. I thought he could use that mine to blow up ships. You know, he could leave it as a bomb on the ship. And then a little knife for if he drops his big knife. And finally, a piece of cork for the base. My plan was to do a beach base, so catching him at the moment where he's walking off the shore and just about to enter the water, about to go on mission. I also desperately wanted to try and get this fan piece from the Void War Bases set onto this miniature somehow as like a propeller. But in the end, I thought it would just be too difficult to make that work. So with the accessories and the equipment chosen, that's only part of the way to helping him feel watery. I also need to think about design elements and I need to think about the color scheme. But before we do color scheme, I want to think about extra parts that I could use. So I grabbed some more of the plastic card that I used in the last episode on the Fire Guys discs. I cut out a small square and then I drew up a design that looked like this. Just in case it's not obvious, that's supposed to be some kind of fin shape, like a fish's fin. And I thought these kind of fins put over the shoulder pad would help give him this really cool, unique look. So I tried to use a pen to draw those shapes on top of the shoulder pad that I drew round, and then I began to cut those shapes out with my knife. It was quite tricky to do this with a knife, and I had to be really careful, and I took my time and did it slowly. I had a look, but I don't own any tools that could help me with this. If you know of something that can help me do this better, let me know down in the comments below. While I finish cutting this piece out, I just wanted to say don't forget to watch the other 2 episodes in this series if you haven't yet already. I hope they'll inspire you with lots of cool ideas to create your own custom Space Marine. With the fin cut out, I wanted to attach it to the shoulder with blue tack just to see that I wasn't being totally mad and this might actually work. And I was thinking, yeah, this actually might work, this could look cool. So then I got to making 3 more fins. And after sketching up 3 more designs, I then cut them all out, and I have to admit that not all of them survived that process. But of the few that I did have 2 that I thought would work well. I also sketched and cut out a smaller fin that I was going to put on the top of the helmet. Because the tips of the fins were extremely fine, I wanted to make sure they wouldn't bend and break too much if I prodded them with my fingers, so I covered each tip in a little bit of super glue that I spread around with a toothpick to try and keep it thin. Moving on from the fins, I wanted to go to the backpack and I wanted to take off that symbol, as I wasn't sure if it specifically represented Navy breaches. I know that I left it on the tank on my fire guy, but this time I thought probably best not to do that because it's going to be a little bit more prominent on his back. So I cut it and then I filed it down until I had something flat. Then I wanted to stick the oxygen tanks themselves onto the backpack, so I experimented with doing this with blue tack first. When I was confident that that was the way I was going to attach it, I grabbed some milliput and I used that to squish into the oxygen tanks, and it would help me squish the parts together so that the rounded part of the backpack would sit nicely in the gap of the oxygen tanks. That would just make my life easier when I glued things together. With the pieces glued, I then stuffed a load of milliput into the gaps left behind. I used my knife to scrape away any excess and then kept shaping it until I had a nice rounded cylinder the whole way round. As I mentioned earlier on, I really wanted to use this fan piece, but I couldn't find a way to get it to work. It was too big and I was going to have to cut away the whole thing. So I used my brain to come up with a different idea. In the previous video on the fire guy, I had cut these pieces of Votan weaponry out, and I was going to plan to use them for some kind of exhaust vents, but that didn't go to plan. I didn't end up using them. So for this model, I thought they might make really cool like water thrusters. And it made sense in my head because as a big heavy space marine, he'd need a way to be propelled through the water. And with that figured out, I decided to grab the cork and start working on the base. I tore a piece that was about the size I wanted, and then I marked where the back of his feet were. I then went on to cut the cork so that it matched where the back of his feet were, so that this piece would fit snugly behind him on the back of his base. Because this was meant to show a beach, I wanted to cut some slopes into the cork to give it a gradual incline. And then I used blue tack to mark where his feet were so that I could stick the cork on knowing exactly where I was going to put him. With the cork stuck on, I then cleaned it up around the edges so it matched the circular shape of the base, and then I glued it into place and it looked like this. It was time to begin gluing the model together. So I grabbed his first arm, which was the one with the knife, and I stuck that on, and then I stuck on his grapple gun arm, which I did move upwards as it was gluing. Then I used super glue to stick my plasticard fin to the shoulder. And then I did the same thing again for a second fin, this time at a diagonal angle. Then I attached my smaller fishy fin to his head. And then going back to the main model, I glued those water thrusters on that I made to the backs of his legs. Because they're existing plastic pieces cut from another kit, they have lots of good details on them. So I didn't have to worry about sculpting those tiny details, but I can still get tiny little grill details and little panel lines in them. Then with the backpack cleaned up and dried, with the milliput, I attached it to the back of the model. It does make the back stick out a little bit further, but because Space Marines are so chonky and I'm going to stick a bunch of stuff underneath it, it will still look all in balance by the end. When I was sticking on the fin shoulder pad, I noticed that it wasn't quite going to fit with the backpack. I hadn't done my due diligence and I hadn't checked to see how the arm would actually fit. So I had to trim up the fin and then I had to glue on the head, and then we had this. And then it was time to just glue on a few more tiny accessories like his extra gun and grapple, as well as a spare knife under his power pack. And then I wanted to clean up and glue on that bomb I was talking about earlier. I used a tiny piece of spare sprue to create this small hook that I then used to attach it to the bottom of the power pack. And then to finish off on the build, the last element was to make the base. And so I used some sand texture paste from Vallejo to cover my beach in its sand. But I also used this to cover the whole bed because it would make sense that there's actually sand under the water as well. And then, with everything glued together and primed, the miniature looked like this. There are a couple of cheeky extra additions I made before I primed the model, and one of those is the big tube that comes out the side of his helmet and goes around to his oxygen tanks on his backpack. I just felt like that made him feel way more like he was actually diving. The second small thing is I added a small gadget to the front of his waist that I thought looked a bit like a depth gauge. Also, something I've been doing for all my models is sticking something to their chest on their right side, and for this guy it was grenades because he didn't have any other grenades, and I thought he would have some grenades if he was jumping on ships and fighting people. If you've seen the other two parts, you'll know that I generally paint the body a darker colour, the legs and the arms a lighter colour, and then the trim around the shoulders and on the chest aquila, I normally paint those an even darker colour. Because this guy represents water, I wanted to mainly use blues. So I began by base coating with abyssal blue from the army painter all over the top half of the model. And when that coat was done, this is what the model looked like. And then I used Aegis Aqua, also from the Army Painter Fanatic range, to paint the lower parts of the model and the arm, including those water thrusters I added to the back. With the base coat for the legs and arms done, I had a miniature that looked like this. And next I painted his chest and his shoulder trim with that dark blue. And initially I tried using Cantor blue from Citadel, but decided that I wanted it to be a little bit darker so it was even more contrasting. So I would actually go back and add black to my Cantor blue to get the mix that I used. For almost all the other details around the model, I began to cover everything with a black base coat. The specific black that I'm using here is from the Army Painter Fanatic range. In this clip, I'm just going over that dark blue area with my Cantor blue and black mix that I mentioned, just to create even more contrast. And I'm just going to show that mix on the palette so you can understand how that colour differed slightly. I decided I wanted to cover my fins in this colour as well, so that there was more of it around the model to create balance. So I did that and I base coated all of this. If I'm honest, the fins have a little bit more texture from the super glue than I'd have liked. So if you're going to do something like this, just be careful with the amount of super glue that you add to hold these things in place. With all those details base coated, the miniature was looking quite good, and so it was time to do some second coats in order to get a nice opaque layer. And that's most noticeable on the legs here. You can see they're way less patchy now. I continued highlighting, but this time on the black parts. So I was doing in the recesses on the undersuit and on some of the accessories like the grenades, the torch on the head, and any parts that I didn't plan to paint with metallic paints. I used a similar recipe here on the black parts to my previous video. So I used charcoal from Vallejo Game Color, and then I used Eshin Grey from Citadel to highlight these areas. Before I began highlighting the dark blue and light blue parts of the armor, I wanted to use a darker shadow color to panel recess shade the bits between the armor. This will just help me increase the contrast even more. To create these shadow colors, I generally just added black to the base coat, but then added in a tiny bit of saturated blue just to make sure I didn't lose too much of the blue color. Before doing the highlights, I did decide to cover the base in dark sand from Vallejo Model Color, just to give it a base coat before I continued. Once again, did some dark panel shading on the dark blue parts on the top half. And with the shadow lines done, you can see there's just a little bit more contrast on the model now. For the highlights on the light blue areas, I added mostly white, but a tiny bit of ice yellow as well. I pretty much knew I was going to do 2 layers of highlights, so while I was trying to be quite neat, I didn't worry about being too neat on these, and if these highlights ended up being a bit chunky, that's fine, because another thinner layer will hopefully come along and brighten everything up. For the dark blue parts, I did the exact same thing, but I just added more ice yellow than white, because I didn't mind if it switched to a bit of a greenish hue in the blue for the highlights on this part. So with that first round of highlights done, this is what the miniature looked like. It started to become defined, but I need one more layer of highlight to really increase the definition. So now you'll start to see me add that last layer of highlight, and once again just added a lot more ice yellow to my mix. And as I said, this final layer of highlight had to be thinner and neater, so I took great care to try and make my lines thin and as neat as possible. For the arms and the legs, the highlight I mixed up was mainly Aegis Aqua and white, and then a tiny bit of ice yellow, and I just had to make sure it was a significant step brighter than the previous highlight layer. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with the eyes of this model. I didn't want to give it the same colour as any of the other models in this little series, so I just thought, why not make them just plain white? And to my surprise, after adding the white paint, I actually thought, wow, it's simple, but it's effective. I really like the way that looks, and it kind of just matches the overall theme. The dark parts of the armor with the Kantor blue mix now looked a bit dark in comparison to everything else, so they needed an extra highlight as well. So I mixed ice yellow and white once again, until I had something that was significantly lighter. You may notice that on the fins there are now some vertical lines. Those are to be reminiscent of the spines in the fins that fish have. I thought it would help break up the flat surfaces and kind of show off more what I was trying to do with these shapes. I couldn't really put water on the actual marine himself, or could I? I don't know, maybe you could do something like that. But I definitely needed to have water on the base. So before I tried to add a water effect to the base, I gave it a base coat of a slightly bluish colour because I thought just in case the transparency of the mix needs to show through, we'll have some blue in the sand. I then did something similar to my acid base video where I put some of the blue mix of those 3 paints I just quickly flashed on the screen, and I added those into the transparent water texture, and then I began to apply that all around the base. Rather foolishly, I hadn't done any tests, so I wasn't exactly sure how this was going to turn out. This is before it dried, and this is after it dried. I would say that it's maybe not as good as I had imagined in my head, but it's definitely not bad, and I can work with this. So to fix things up a bit, first I decided to add some wet sand to the beach. I found a colour called brown sand from Vallejo, and I thought that must be perfect for this, so I started to apply it to the edges of the sand where the waves would have fallen onto the beach. And I also used this colour to shade some of the back areas of the sand. And then so that the sand didn't look flat, I decided to do a highlight of pale sand from Vallejo. And then in my attempt to bring life to the water, I wanted to add white to the tips of the little waves and ripples in the water. This didn't initially make the water look that good, but when I combined that with some scratchy texturing with a light blue, I ended up getting water that I was a lot more happy with. The scratching and the texturing made the surface break up more, and it felt more like the whole thing was actually moving and more dynamic. To finish up, there were a few small details I wanted to paint. I wanted to do an extra highlight on some of the black areas with a light grey, and then I came back and I did another highlight layer on the dark blue parts because once again I thought they were still too dark in comparison to the other areas. The last main part of the miniature to paint was all the metallic parts, so I used dark silver from Pro Acryl to lay in base coats, and then I added increasing amounts of silver to the mix until I had a much brighter highlight colour. And as we get to painting all of that metal up and getting towards finishing the miniature, I just want to say massive thanks for the support on the last video. It's been fantastic. This series has really helped my channel grow a lot, which is brilliant. I've seen some comments that say, oh, I love that idea, I'd like to steal it for myself, and other people's comments that say, oh, I'd have done it differently if I did it. And I think that's exactly the point. If this video can inspire you to try something else your way, or to make your own set of elemental space marines where you do things completely differently, and you can set your own rules and you can use whatever pieces you want, you can buy as many pieces, you can make as many pieces, you can 3D print pieces, you can design them yourself. You know, there's really no limit to the possibilities, and I love that 100 different people could make these elemental space marines 100 different ways. And every time it would be interesting to see the spin that each person puts on it. One final thing I added was some rust. I did this with Mornfang Brown, and I did it around the metal areas just to show that maybe some of his weapons are starting to go a bit rusty because he's used them underwater a lot. And now it's time for me to show you the final miniature. Here he is. I hope you like him. I hope you think that he represents water well. I can't believe we're already into the 3rd week of this mini-series, and I'm really excited to get started on the Air Elemental Space Marine next week. If you like what I've made here, but you haven't seen the previous 2 episodes, then go check those out on my channel. They're Earth and Fire, and they look really cool. If you want to help me grow, click all the buttons below. You know the drill, and I'm going to get started working on the next video.